Have you ever wondered where real estate fits in your portfolio? If you're anything like me, you've heard of person after person who has gotten rich from real estate. But you also remember the housing market crash of 2008 where people lost everything. Makes things a little bit confusing. My name is Grady Cool, CEO of Cool Wealth Management. I'm more educated than 99% of advisors with an entire alphabet of letters behind my name, including a CFA, CFP, and MBA. I'm going to explain to you why exactly you should consider real estate and where it potentially might fit in your portfolio. Before we get into the why and the where, we need to talk about what exactly all falls under the umbrella that is real estate. At its simplest core, real estate is owning a building or land. Easiest example is owning your own home. Now, outside of that, you can also buy something and rent it out to someone else, whether it's for a business, them living in it, no matter what it is. Building or land, you live in it, use it, or someone else does. There are a handful of main reasons people get into real estate. While there are others, these are the really big points you need to know. Tax advantages are huge, including write-offs and ways to avoid capital gains through tax loopholes. There are large amounts of leverage available through mortgages, meaning you have large amounts of debt that you can pay off safely while investing extra money towards other things, thus increasing your returns at those other things. Real estate provides consistent returns through rent. Real estate has appreciated faster than inflation by 2 to 3% over the last 100 years in America. And finally, it offers diversification relative to stocks and bonds. How well your particular investments do within these massive benefits you can get highly depends on which investments you pick. As mentioned earlier, the most common type of real estate is purchasing shelter for you and your family. Instead of renting, you buy. This can include a freestanding house, a condo, an apartment, anything where you own a piece of it and you get to stay in it. For the vast majority of people, the only way this is going to be possible is in the form of a mortgage. The value of the house can be used to offset the value of the debt, and then, as long as the value doesn't decline too much, people can stay in the house, slowly building value that they own over time. Now let's get into some of those tax benefits. If this is your first home, you can use some of the mortgage interest to write off against some of your income taxes from your job within certain stipulations. In a similar vein, your property taxes are capped at $10,000 for your household within that first home. Thankfully, if you decide to move and you've lived there for at least 2 of 5 years, you may qualify for a capital gains exclusion. Capital gains is what happens when your property increases in value and then you go to sell it. For example, if there's a house worth $100,000 and then you live there for 5 years, then it increases to $150,000 and you sell it, that difference of $50,000 you're going to owe taxes on unless you have some sort of exclusion. There are certain tax code exemptions that do allow households to push off paying those capital gains if you purchase a home that is very similar to your current home and you qualify for those exemptions. Deferring those taxes can be especially helpful when you take into consider things like a stepped-up basis, where when someone passes away, gives the house to someone else, then those capital gains disappear. Basically, if my grandfather bought a home for $200,000, he passes away, gives it to me, and it's now worth $500,000. Instead of that $300,000 I'd have to normally pay taxes on, I no longer have to pay anything because the new basis is at $500,000. Trusts and exemptions can really complicate the rules. The rules change over time. Planning needs to be done carefully, but the tax advantages can be absolutely huge. With all of these tax advantages, always make sure to check irs.gov or consult with some sort of tax professional before pulling the trigger. All of the other benefits mentioned earlier also apply to owning your own home, except for income. That only comes from renting out property to others. As long as you live in the property for a long period, things like market fluctuations won't be as much of a concern, but generally having so much of your overall portfolio tied up into a single asset in the form of just owning your home can be a little bit concerning when you compare it to things like other asset classes. When you own lots of stocks or lots of bonds, you buy tons of them for diversification among the asset class, so if one of them does poorly, you're not in such a bad position. Generally, houses go up over time, so if you don't have to time selling, it goes pretty well. But take an extreme example like Centralia, Pennsylvania. Coal mining town back in the 1960s had a massive fire. You could have lived there for an extra 20 years holding the property, and if you needed to sell the home and move somewhere else, you wouldn't have gotten your money back. You would have gotten less than half of what you put into it. That can be really concerning, but that's a fairly extreme example. Just something to keep in mind when putting so many eggs into a single basket of just your house. The next most common thing people do with real estate is buying a house and renting it out to someone else long term. If I purchased a home here in Phoenix and then decided that I wanted to move across the country to New Hampshire for some new job, then I would need to either sell my house or I need to rent it out to somebody else. Since renting out properties to others is usually done while you own 2 houses or 3 houses, generally speaking, it happens where someone moves out and then they just take that property and rent it out to somebody else. That being said, renting out a place to a single tenant can be a little scary since if they have an accident or get fired or just generally a crappy person and don't pay their rent on time or at all, you could lose a lot of money in the process, meaning your overall returns for the year are significantly lower than they would be otherwise. Renting a place out causes maintenance costs. People are going to use things, they're going to wear out over time. You can either pay someone to deal with all that stuff for you, or you can deal with it all yourself. If you pay somebody, that means there are costs that are lowering your returns every single year. If you do it yourself, there is something called the pain in the ass factor. You're fixing toilets, you're going in, you're up in attics, it's summertime, you're absolutely miserable in the 110-degree attic. It just makes your life kind of suck. But you also could be using those hours you're spent doing that just working at your job even more. If you're salaried, then it can make a little bit more sense because you couldn't have been earning extra income because of how things get capped. But these are things you need to consider when you're renting out a house to someone. There are a lot of hidden costs with it. If you do want to pay somebody else to do some of this work, it is hard finding good help if you don't do it very often. People don't want to call up and get help for something once a year. They want consistent business. There is a combination of these two things where you buy a house, have a mortgage, and then have people live in it. What that looks like is you live in one room, they live in another room, or you have a duplex where it's like 2 separate units, but you own the whole thing. That being said, generally want this to be with someone that you know fairly well. Some of the legal end on this can get a little bit hard with liability, so generally want to be safe with this, but it can be a pretty sweet situation if you're a fairly young person, someone else is paying your mortgage and you don't mind kind of an awkward living arrangement. With similar concerns on legal liabilities come short-term rentals such as Airbnb. This can be great if you have a vacation home that you like visiting for a few weeks a year, but you're also looking for a way to pay the mortgage on your place you visit all the time. The costs on this usually tend to be a lot higher, where you have to pay cleaning ladies and all sorts of other people to come in, fix the place up, make sure they're taking care of tenants, towels, sheets, all that's ready to go. Because there's so many people that are coming through, there's more bodies, more people that can always just go,
"Hey, I'm gonna sue you."
But that being said, it can also be a great way to get a lot more income because the rates on these things tend to be significantly higher. If it's somewhere that's attached to vacationing, if the place slows down, that can also eat into returns. So just take that into consideration as well. The laws around these things change every single year and they're getting worse and worse for the landlord. So again, just keep these things in mind. With the trend of more and more people working from home ever since the world-changing events of 2020,
with the name that shall not be named so that we don't get flagged,
commercial real estate has changed quite a bit. It used to be, it was really easy to rent out lots and lots of spaces, but now it can be a little bit tougher. These tend to be longer term rentals, meaning you put down a lease for 3 to 5 years and the tenant just stays throughout that whole period. That being said, the business actually has to do well enough to pay its own rent, which has its own form of risk. This can be a tougher area to get into. Down payments tend to be larger and buildings tend to be worth significantly more. This is why there are 2 general ways people get invested here if they're not bonkos rich. First, we have syndication. Syndication, or any type of private fund, has a basic concept behind it. A bunch of investors come together and pool their money together. This is generally done as a private matter, meaning friend of a friend. People get together and they actually talk about this type of thing through networking. They take their money, they give it to one guy or a small group of people, and they're going to manage a bunch of different properties, and then you're all going to take away a small piece of the returns. Some funds do absurdly well, while others, not so much. You have much less control in an investment like this. There are a ton of management fees, meaning the guy who knows how to invest actually wants to make a lot of money from this type of thing, even though he's also paying the fees for taking care of tenants, making sure the building works well, all the things that any other real estate investing would have as far as costs. This is why trust is absolutely huge when picking what private fund you are going to be a part of. A REIT, otherwise known as a real estate investment trust, is just a much larger public fund. You can trade it just like a stock. This doesn't tend to have as much leverage involved, meaning the returns usually aren't as good as something like a private fund can be. That being said, it does still help with all the diversification that you might be looking for. Now, where exactly does real estate fit in your portfolio? I can't tell you the exact specifics on the exact price to pay and the exact property to pick without knowing your specific situation, but I can give you some general ideas on when to consider it and what type might work for you. If you're aiming for a mathematically optimal portfolio where you're looking for higher returns and lower risk in terms of numbers, then looking at things like a 401k match or a Roth IRA may be worth considering before going headfirst into your first property. If you feel uncomfortable with stocks or bonds, real estate can replace part of that in your portfolio. For bonds, it'll be something like, let's make as aggressive a payments on our mortgage as possible and get all of it paid off so that we don't have to deal with any more debt. Whereas if you want to replace part of your stocks, it might be using as much leverage as you can, meaning making the minimum amount of payments on your mortgage while you invest in other things. If you want the highest possible returns in your portfolio and you're perfectly fine with a crappy situation, then leveraged real estate can increase the returns of your portfolio if done well. If done well is a key indicator. This adds to the risk as well if you mess up construction, hire the wrong person, or get a bad tenant. If you have a high income tax bracket, then owning your own home can be a great way to lower your income taxes through using mortgage interest to help deduct some of it. For a lot of people, adding real estate to your portfolio is a great way to add some diversification relative to just being all in on stocks or bonds. Make sure to be comfortable with the risk and familiar with the tax law before pulling the trigger, but otherwise, real estate can be a great asset class.